today. I have a niece, and she's got 2 little ones, and her baby's 8 months old, and her little guy is 4. And we share the responsibility of our children. They're our collective children. They're really my grandchildren, but they're not allowed to call me Cookum because I'm only 34. So don't call me Cookum in public. I'm great at. So we share the responsibility of raising our children, and it's a beautiful thing. I'm lucky. I consider myself blessed. Not all of our women have that same support. The other things that I learned was from a female elder, and she talked about how there was very specific ceremonies just specifically for women. So when a baby was coming into this world, the women delivered that baby, and there was only women in that lodge. There was no men allowed in that lodge. And the men were not allowed until the baby was born, and they had a song and a name for the baby. And actually with my last child, the father of my children, it just so happened that I sent him off to work that day. I'm like, no, you go to work. I won't have this baby till way later. Well, surprise, she came like 2 hours later. But I actually thought, him and I had talked about it, and I said, why don't I just keep it where it's just myself and my friend Terry, my female friend Terry. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, because the first child, he sat and read a newspaper. And while I was delivering, and he was clicking on his gum, and the nurse got so mad at him, and she said, could you please stop clicking on that damn gum? And he was very nervous. He was very, very nervous. And it wasn't until I learned these things where I realized that that's not his place. As a Nehiyaw man, that's not his place. And his body, his DNA was telling him, this isn't where I'm supposed to be right now. Although he wanted to be there for the birth of his children, that's his body was telling him, this isn't where you're supposed to be. I want to talk briefly, because I want to get to the stuff about attachment and healing and so on. But there's just some important things that I learned that I thought were super important about the chemistry of trauma. And again, some of this stuff may be super repetitive and things like that, but there's 2 main elements that make an event traumatic. And they are the nature of the event. So traumatic events are usually events during which you are at risk of being very seriously injured, or you fear that you're going to die. And the meaning of the event to the person who's experiencing it, super important. We can all agree on that there's certain things, certain acts that we would all consider traumatic. Something like rape, we probably would all agree that that's traumatic. But what I may consider trauma, maybe my dog dying, may not be what someone else would say, well, it's just your dog. But if that dog has been in my family and I have an attachment to that dog and so on, that can be very traumatic. So it's the meaning of the event that also makes it traumatic. There's approximately 1,500 different chemical reactions going through your body when something traumatic, you're experiencing something traumatic. And they all are happening to help you and your body and your brain manage that trauma. Adrenaline, things like that, your blood pressure raises, your heart beats faster, you have all these different cool things happening in your body to keep you alive, really. There's different types of trauma. There's single incident trauma, things like a car accident, an isolated event, where there was no other kind of layers of trauma added to it. There's complex trauma, which is something that I definitely see a lot of in our communities. I think that complex trauma was probably one of the most important types of trauma for me to understand. I worked with mental health and addictions in my community for a couple of years. I also worked with income support, with maternal child health, and I kind of dipped my feet into different places in the community. And I can't tell you that there was not a single person I worked with that didn't experience complex trauma. And complex trauma is all kind of like this onion, and it's just layers and layers and layers of trauma that just pile up on top of one another and are wrapped around one another. And at the core, there's this really serious unresolved grief. And when you don't have an outlet, or you don't have an opportunity, or you don't feel safe to deal with that, then it just keeps adding and layering. And I don't know why I use this metaphor, but it's like a hairball, you know, like when a cat licks itself and they get that, and they spit it out, and, you know, and there's this hairball, and it's like, oh my God, what do you do with all that? You know, or there's this buildup of hair. And that's a horrible metaphor. But that's what I find. I create metaphors in my head, and that's kind of one of them. So the complex trauma is a lot like that, where there's, for example, we have multiple deaths in our community, multiple. I was just out in Maskwacis in what used to be called Hobima, it's now Maskwacis, or actually always has been Maskwacis. But I was just out there not long ago speaking to some youth, and we were talking about the deaths in their community, and it's just overwhelming to just hear. It's overwhelming to hear the amount of loss in the community, and they're all connected. All of them. We are all connected. And you know, and my community is really tiny compared to Maskwacis. My community is small. And so when we have a death, it's somebody we know immediately. If it's not someone we know directly, it's our friend's grandfather. It's somebody that we know. And when you have multiple deaths that just keep adding up again, you're not given an opportunity, a space to grieve the first one, because then the second one happens the week later. And we find sometimes that we have so many deaths that we have one body being grieved, one spirit being grieved, and there's a next one waiting to come in. And so it's multiple, again, layers. So the other type of trauma, which I focus on a lot in my work, is intergenerational or historical. You're right, that is a hard word to say. Or historical trauma. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is actually the person who coined and has done a lot of the initial work with intergenerational trauma. So if you're interested, check her out if you haven't already. She's amazing. But that's kind of where I focus my work, and understanding that, and a lot of that, a very basic understanding of intergenerational trauma really is just about the transmission of trauma and pain and a whole lot of other things that I'll talk about to the next generation, and unknowingly. And I would also say that not only is it unknowingly that we are transmitting this trauma, but I think we do it with a lot of resistance too, because it's not something you want to pass on to the next generation. Let's see. Experiencing any type of traumatic event can create all kinds of things, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, a lot of those things. I remember early on, my parents are amazing people, and when I was about 15, they opened their doors to young men who had nowhere to go. They were in care, and they opened their home to boys who just have been shut. Every door was shut on them. And so my parents' place was kind of like this last resort, and they ran, it was a home. And so we were told to treat them like they were our brothers, and we did. They were my brothers, and I was their sister. And when they would come into our home, they would come in with all types of labels attached to them, tons of labels, different anxiety disorders and depression and all these types of things, ADHD and things like that. And I remember when because my dad had no knowledge of he has no awareness of mental health issues, and he just didn't have that awareness. And I remember him saying a long time ago, he said, well, he was talking about a group of two of the boys that were in the home, and he was saying, well, they're not depressed. He said, they're just really super sad. Like, he said, look at the trauma in their lives. Look at the places that they've been. Look at where they've come from. Like, they're just super sad kids. And you know, he would talk about different mental health issues, and he would say, and I looked at, a lot of the symptoms of ADHD or things like that, and they're very connected to trauma. So we sometimes over-label children. We sometimes we just do that a lot. And sometimes it's really about allowing youth, children, adults to really, like I said, have an outlet to grieve and to find safety in that. Again, I don't want to focus too much on this, but that's what my brain looks like most days. I don't know about you. Kind of like how mine, like today, right now, that's how my brain looks. And so, if any of you are familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Gourmate, they do some super cool stuff around the brain. And Dr. Bruce Perry has done tons of research with severely traumatized children. And some of the very basic research that he's done with children is around the brain and predisposition to different things and utero stress levels and things like that. So he did this really cool. He kind of broke it down, and he talked about how our brains are set up. And we have this super cool little traffic cop in the front of our brains right here in the cerebral cortex, and that little traffic cop is kind of like saying, no, whoa, and he's in charge of abstract thinking and decision making and things like that. Dr. Bruce Perry in his research has found that there was some shrinkage of that cerebral cortex, and there may have been that part of our brains may be impacted when we are traumatized. And so I often wonder, and after learning that, I often wondered, what does a residential school survivor's cerebral cortex, what is their traffic cop doing? Are they there? Are they working today? Or did they kind of just say, nope, not working today? And that's probably the case. I think about my dad, and I think about his ability to make what people might consider healthy or unhealthy choices and things that he may or may not have done in his life. And I kind of make that assumption. I can kind of guess that, that traffic cop is just kind of like out to lunch. He's just not working. And so I think about the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of children who may have had that same damage to their traffic cop. Our brains are a historical organ. We have genetic gifts, and they manifest themselves, and it's adults in our lives who do that, who help manifest those gifts. And in an Indigenous context, or a Cree, I can speak from a Cree context, from a Nahio context, because I'm Cree. I can't really speak for all of my other Indigenous brothers or sisters, but we have tons of ceremony in our communities, and these ceremonies are timed through development, through childhood development. And so we have things like a rites of passage ceremony that are for children who are coming to their time, of girls who are having their first moon time. We call it moon time because it's our grandmother moon who visits us for our first menstrual cycle. And then our young boys, when they're about 12, they have their first kill. They kill an animal and it's celebrated, and they have a fast. And so we have these ceremonies that are all appropriately timed to help those gifts manifest themselves. And so we have children and we have children who are able to understand what their gift is pretty early on in life. And that having that gift and knowing what your name is, like my name, Utsbigasis, I didn't know what that was until I was in my 20s. I had no idea. I just knew it was a cute little name. I was like, hey, yeah, I'm a little spider, right on. But having no relationship to that. I had no relationship to it. So it was really important for me to understand what my relationship was to that name. We have a Nitsi ceremony. So our Nitsi is our belly button. When I introduced myself, I said, Amber Dia Mitsigasun. Mitsigasun means my connection to my mother. The umbilical cord is what connects us to our mothers. And so when I introduce myself, I don't just say, my name is Amber. I say, my name is Amber and I'm connected to Arlene Dion, my mother. And that Nitsi, that belly button, when it comes off, when our babies are born, we keep that belly button and we take it to ceremony, and we're told sometimes what to do with it, or we make a choice as parents what we're going to do with that belly button. For my first daughter, I didn't know what to do because that wasn't done for me, because my parents didn't know. And a lot of our children and youth didn't have that Nitsi ceremony. But when my oldest daughter was born, I held onto her belly button for 9 years. And she was stuck to me like glue, I'll tell you. And I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew I should not lose it or throw it away. I knew that. Something was telling me, don't you dare throw that away, don't you dare lose that. So I hung on to it for 9 years. When my little girl was born, again, I hung on to it. I didn't know what to do with it. So it wasn't until last summer that I finally said to their dad, I'm like, we gotta do something with these belly buttons. Something is telling me we gotta do something. And so we went to my auntie and we said, what do we do? She said, let's have a ceremony. She said, where do you want them buried? Where do you want your kids' belly buttons buried? And I said, I want them buried on my mom and dad's land, in the reserve at home. There's a huge tree outside my mom's house. And I said, I want them buried there. So we did. We had a ceremony. We buried my kids' belly buttons there. And my auntie asked me why. And I said, because I always want my kids to know where home is. I always want them to have those roots. And I want them to know where home is. And home is Kihiwin. That's home. And I don't ever want them to stray too far away from that. And I want them to always have those roots there. And so we did. And it was beautiful and it was amazing. I think about now that I have the knowledge that I didn't have back then, I think about, I used to work in group care here in Edmonton when I was younger. And again, my parents had the boys in their home. And our boys and our young people run. They run and they run and they run. And where do they run to? They run home. It doesn't matter how dysfunctional the home is. It doesn't matter how messed up we might think it is. They go home. I often wonder, because the teaching with the Nitsi is that if the Nitsi is lost, if it's lost or it accidentally is thrown away, or it is thrown away because the parent doesn't know, that child will always be wandering. They're always going to be looking for a connection somewhere. And so a lot of these youth, I wonder what happened to their Nitsi, what happened to their belly button, what happened to that connection. And they're constantly searching for that connection. And so that was just my theory in my head of what might have happened. And the joyful and the beautiful thing is that we can create that for people, and that there's some really cool people out there who create a Nitsi ceremony for somebody who maybe had theirs lost, and that there's still those ceremonies that can happen. What kind of protects us from experiencing trauma and staying in the trauma, I guess is the words I would use, is a lot of different things. There's a lot of different protective factors. Having support, of course, any type of social support, whether it be family or a helper of some sort, having support is vital. Optimism and healthy self-esteem. Aptitude, so feeling or being very resourceful and having a lot of resources. Spirituality is key. I remember when I was in my social work diploma program, and my auntie, I was at a really very, very strange place in my life. And I remember going to my auntie's house, and I remember sitting there, and I plopped myself on her couch, and I told her everything. I just let it all out of what was going on in my life. And I wanted to quit school, and I just wanted to quit life. I just wanted to check out and be done. And I remember my auntie listening to me. She sat there for I don't even know how long. And she sat there on her chair, and she listened away. And when I was done, I was like, okay, there, I'm done. And I was waiting for this, I don't know what I was waiting for. I was waiting for some kind of advice. And she looked over at me and she said, Kiam. Okay. That's all she said. And for those of you who are non-Cree speakers, Kiam in our language, how I understood it growing up, was Kiam means, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Leave it alone. Let it go. That kind of stuff. And she said, and I said, well, but I do care. And that was my response to her. And she said, no. She said, the word Kiam actually means I do care. And I care so much so that I can't handle all of this on my own. I'm carrying all of this stuff. It's piling up and it's on my shoulders and it's heavy. And she said, Kiam actually means that there's something much bigger than you out there looking after you, taking care of you, and you can let it go to them. You can give it up to them. And you can say, I can't handle all this pain right now. I can't handle all of this stuff. I'm going to give it up to somebody who's much more powerful than I am, because I'm a pitiful human being. And there's something much bigger out there that can take that from me. And I was like, whoa. I'm like, that is life-changing. So now I'm like, Kiam everything, Yam. Everything. But seriously, I think about how I get into this a little bit later, but I'll mention it now, but I think about how for a long time I carried a history of pain, like a history of it. And there was just, again, that complex grief and that complex trauma was just building, and I felt like I was carrying the pain of generations on my shoulders all of the time. And I really felt like I had to do something about it. You know, when I first got especially my BSW, I really wanted to change the world. I did. And I had my own agenda about how I was going to change the world, and it didn't work. It just didn't, you know? But at the same time, I felt like I could still make small little changes in the circle of where I was at, behind my door, you know, in my classroom, or however it was. And I think that that once I started to learn what I did learn, I was like, I'm going to go there and change everything now, because I know it. And you know, I was very naive, and at the same time, I also had a lot of passion and drive, and that I wouldn't change either. But, you know, I think about how they call it the curse of the competent, or the curse of the consciousness. And, you know, when you have a knowledge and you have a new understanding of the world around you, and you have a new understanding of who you are and where you come from, it's a call to action. Like, you kind of have to do something about it. And unfortunately, I got really caught up in that, and which is why now I'm like, Kim. Those are my babies. That's Damaris in the blue and Lyric in the black shirt. They're a lot bigger than that now. Their hair is a lot longer, and I'm a little bit older. But I like to take some time to talk about attachment, because this, again, was probably one of the most groundbreaking for me, groundbreaking understandings, and a lot of unlearning took place for me. I had to unlearn a lot, and I had to relearn a lot. There was a lot of things that I learned that were not healthy and that were not okay, and I had to unlearn those behaviors, especially when I had children. So touch is like the most critical sensory pathway that it develops first in infants. It develops before sight and smell and hearing and all that stuff. Touch is vital. Human touch, healthy human touch is vital. I remember when my babies were born, and I think most women who may have had children or have children can probably connect to this, that when babies are born, we put them on our skin immediately. There's that immediate skin-to-skin contact, and that's really important. I don't know about you, but whenever I see a baby, I don't care whose baby it is, but whenever I see a baby, I get like super like crazy. And so I'm like, ah, my voice gets all high pitched, and I start like scaring them, and I'm like, oh my gosh, the baby! And the baby's looking at me like, oh my god. But I get like super like excited, and I look at babies, and I smile at them, and I goo and I ga, and I say, I'm me, and you know, whatever. That's how babies make sense of the world. Literally, that's how they make sense of the world. That is how they connect to love. That is how, their sensory pathways are growing like crazy when we do that to babies. When we look at them in their eyes and we talk to them and we love them up that way, they are literally connecting that to love. And so it's so important that we do that with little babies. It doesn't matter how, whatever you look like, just do it. And I do, trust me. So if anyone's got a baby around. And you know, prior to the research that I did, I used to believe that trauma was something, it was an act that had to happen to you. So I believed that, I really did. I believed that trauma was an act that had to happen to you, and it had to be a violent act. I believed that in all my heart and soul. And it wasn't until I started learning about human touch and eye contact and all of those wonderful things that I started to think, wait, maybe trauma is something that doesn't happen to you. And so if you did not receive healthy touch, if you did not receive someone looking at you in your eyes and giving you positive affirmations and loving you up and getting all crazy when they see you, if you didn't receive those things, those are basic human needs, and if you didn't receive those things, that can be just as traumatic as a violent act. So we often look at what has happened to people, and not so much focused on what hasn't happened to people. And I think that was really important. That was a huge aha moment for me in the work that I was doing, because again, we were so focused. When I worked in addictions treatment and addictions counseling, we looked for those things. We looked for violent acts. We looked for acts that were done to a person, but we never really asked them, what didn't you get? You got all this stuff, but what didn't you get? And and we see that a lot with emotional neglect and physical neglect and things like that. But with some of our adults, we don't necessarily look at that stuff. And so it's really important that we do. I remember I was in Saddle Lake for a conference one day, and there was a lady there, and she was an elderly lady, and she was talking to us. We were there as addictions treatment or addictions counselors, and she was talking to us, and she said, I don't know why you ladies go and make a whole other room for your baby across the hall or down the hall or whatever. She said, I don't know why you do that. She said, we never did that. She said, we slept with our babies until they were 18 months old. And by then, I'd have another baby. And that baby would go sleep with their sibling or something like that. And I'd be breastfeeding. And she said, doctors and scientists are trying to figure out SIDS. They've been trying to figure that out for a long time. And she said, what it is that our babies, when they're left alone and they're crying or they're in their crib alone at night, and our moms don't know that they shouldn't leave them like that. The other little baby spirits will come and take that baby because they want to play. And that's why they take that baby, is because they want to play with that baby. And I thought, I never thought of it that way. That's just very different perspective. And she was talking about, really what she was talking about is the importance of healthy human touch. Really what she was talking about is developing attachment with our babies and being close to our babies and staying close to them and having them close to our skin. There's a lot of teachings about moss bags and cradle boards and things like that I will not go into, but there's a whole teaching around that and about how that's important as well. Our children's bones, we're told that our children stay connected to the spiritual realm, very connected to the spiritual realm until they're about 7, because that is when their bones are fully developed. But until then, they're very connected to our spiritual realm, so they can easily go into different realms and see things that us adults cannot see. A lot of these teachings really opened up my eyes to my own understandings, my own life. Like I said, my dad went to residential school. He was at the Blue Quills residential school from the time he was 7 until he was 11. And then he was forced into an off-reserve school as part of the integration policy. So he was off-reserve school for a long time. During the residential school experience, hundreds of children were supervised by one person. Hundreds of children supervised by one person. They were not nurtured, they were supervised. And they were directed by the sound of a bell, all day a bell, to get up, to walk down the hall, to eat breakfast, to line up. And it was constant lining up, bell, this lining up, bell. Everything was to the sound of a bell. There was no freedom in creativity. Everyone had the same haircut, everyone wore the same clothing, your birthday was not celebrated, your name was taken from you, and you were known as a number. I look at my Auntie Madeline Dion Stout. She has done some really cool stuff in the area of First Nations health, especially for women, and she's got such an amazing sense of style, like just super amazing. Every time I see her, she's wearing something just awesome. And I remember she showed up at a awards ceremony, and she was wearing these little antlers on her head. And we were all looking at her like, okay, do you? That's cool. And I remember her and I had a conversation not long after that, and I told her, I said, Auntie, you have such an amazing sense of style. She wears the most vibrant clothes, like bright, and really dresses herself well. And she said, you know what? She said, you know what, my girl? She said, when we were in residential school, I tried to wear my stockings differently, and I was beaten for it. She said, so now I can dress however the hell I want, and I'm going to wear whatever the hell I want, and it feels good. And it was her act of resistance to kind of dress however she chose, and to really express herself, because creativity was not encouraged at all. And she also talked a lot about my grandmother and how my grandmother used to tell them as children, you decorate yourself. As a Nehiosquo, as a Native woman, as a First Nations, a Cree woman, you decorate yourself. So my grandmother, and I remember this, my grandmother passed away in the year 2000. And my grandmother would always wear really colorful tams, those little hats. And she would always wear really colorful dresses. And her hair was always done really well. And she'd wear perfect little scarves. And she would always tell her children, you decorate yourself, especially as a woman. That's what you do. And so my auntie definitely decorates herself. The other important thing that I realized and became aware of was sibling relationships. And if we look at our sibling relationships today, they're a little mushy. My dad and his siblings, my grandmother had 10 children, birth children, and 7 of them were removed from her home at once and sent to residential school, and the 3 little ones stayed home because they were too small to go at the time. And my dad and his brothers were put on one side, and my aunties were all on the other. When my Auntie Madeline, again, told me a story about how the only time they ever got to see each other was on the playground, and they were discouraged from talking to one another, and they were actually, they were punished if they did talk to one another. And she said she remembers the story, and her story has been written, so I'll share it. She talks about a time when she was in the cafeteria. My dad was sitting directly across from her. My auntie's older than my dad. They're all 2 years apart. And my auntie said that my dad, I don't know what my dad did or what someone thought he might have did, because children weren't beaten for something they did necessarily. And my dad was being punished for something, and he was being beaten. And my auntie said that she was sitting across the cafeteria and she was watching her little brother being beaten, and there was nothing she could do. And she talked about that helplessness, and that she wanted to run over and comfort him and hold him like she would have if they were home. And she couldn't. She wasn't allowed to do that. And so residential school really damaged our sibling relationships. We have a lot of adults who don't know how to be brother and sister, who don't know what that relationship looks like. And so my dad and his siblings are all in their 60s and 70s, and they're learning how to be siblings now. And it's beautiful, but it's taken them a really long time to get there, to learn how to be siblings again and what that means. Growing up, I don't have a lot of memory of hearing I love you. I don't have a lot of memory of being held or being hugged. I didn't understand. I didn't know what I was missing out on. I had no clue. Kids don't know, adults don't know, people don't know what they don't know. And so I had no idea what I was missing out on. And it wasn't until I did all of my post-secondary at Blue Quills. And so I remember sitting in classrooms at Blue Quills College. And I remember sitting there and learning about residential school and learning about trauma and learning about healthy human touch. And I remember sitting there thinking, holy shit. I am sitting in the classroom where my dad sat when he was 7 years old. And I can't tell you what exactly went through me. I can't tell you how that felt. But I remember feeling like my world was crashing down. I remember feeling like everything was just crashing down around me. And it was in those rooms where my dad's little tiny spirit was taken from him. And that's where I started to learn about who I was. And it was life-changing. And it was in those classrooms where I was able to forgive my father for some of the things that he didn't do, the hugs and the I love yous. And what I realized is that my dad was protecting us, because touch, human touch, healthy touch, no such thing in residential school. Absolutely not. My dad's story is brutal. My dad has never told me his story. He's never looked at me and told me his story, and to be quite honest, I don't know if I could sit there and hear it. My mom knows his story. And she's told us pieces of his story to help us understand him, my siblings and I. But my auntie has told me that there's certain things that a father doesn't tell his daughter, and the story is one of them. And he would never tell me that. The things that I do know are too much for me to handle and bear. What it did, the courage, I'm always just so blown away, and it will never stop surprising me how absolutely courageous and brave our survivors are to tell their stories. That just blows me away, and it just humbles the heck out of you when you hear people share their stories of pain, especially in residential schools. Although I can't think about a specific time where my dad said I love you or gave me a hug, not long ago I was doing some healing work, because healing is lifelong. And I was doing some healing work, and I remember sitting there thinking, when did I feel loved as a kid? And I would sit there. I would sit there and I'd sit there and I'd close my eyes and I would think. And I was overthinking so much, trying to remember a time where I felt loved. And I remember we were out ice fishing, a couple friends. We went out ice fishing not long ago. And I was like, this is it. That was it. And I remember going home and I was cleaning a fish. I was scaling it and I was filleting another one. And it was like my brain just went crazy. And I was like, that is when I felt the most loved. My dad didn't tell me he loved me. He didn't hug me, but he took me hunting. And we'd go out and snare rabbits. We'd set snares, and I remember walking out to the bush and going out and setting snares and then going to check the snares. And if we got a rabbit, oh my gosh, that was just heaven. And we'd take it home, and he would show me how to clean the rabbit. Then we'd go out duck hunting, and we'd shoot a duck. And we'd go home, and we would sit outside in our backyard. And we had a brick stove, or a brick fireplace in our backyard. And he would teach me how to clean a duck. So I would pluck it, and I would put it over the fire and singe it all off. And I remember the smells. I can remember the smells. Well, how could you forget duck? But I remember the smells, and I could literally feel things in my hands. And then we'd go fishing. And my favorite part was laying the newspaper out on the table, on the kitchen table. And he would teach me how to clean a fish. And that is when my dad loved me. It's usually not the part I cry on. And I'm wearing fake eyelashes, so I have I intentionally didn't wear mascara. That is when I felt the most loved. I felt beautiful, and I felt good. And I remember being a little kid and looking up at him, and he would tell me how to clean the fish, and he would show me. And I've never felt more loved in my entire life. See, I told you. I'm glad you stole Kleenex for me. And what I know now is that hunting and gathering is attachment. When our people used to teach their children and their community members how to hunt and where to gather things from, that is attachment. There is attachment there. Not just attachment to the person you're with, but attachment to the land and attachment to everything around you. When our ways of knowing and our ways of doing were threatened, and that right, that inherent right to hunt and gather was threatened, that was an attack on our families. That was an attack on attachment. Prior to residential school, our people ate from the earth. They ate off the land. I remember when we were kids, our favorite thing to do with our cookum, my grandmother, was to go and pick Saskatoons. And she had a big Saskatoon bush behind her house. And we would go there as kids with her, and she'd bring a pail, and she'd fill it up in like minutes. And she'd shake the tree, and it would all go in her apron, and she'd fill up a pail. And we were all kids like, oh my God, I don't know what we're doing. And it was amazing to watch her, the way she would pick berries. It was just phenomenal. And we always had fresh berries, and we always had wild game. I grew up eating moose meat, rabbit, duck, fish, you name it, and that's what we ate. And when children went into residential schools, we're learning stories about the food that they were fed. And it's appalling what the children were fed in residential schools. There's stories of children being fed rotten food that's weeks old. My dad remembers the food having no color. There was never any color in the food. It was always gray. Everything was gray. The porridge in the morning was overly salty, and I know this because my dad still makes porridge overly salty. And it was bread and porridge. The other story that my dad has shared with me, the very few that he shared with me, one of them was about bread. And when they were kids in the school, and I hate even using the word school because that's not what residential schools weren't schools. And I'll talk about that later. But when they were there in the institution, they were told to go down to the gym because they were going to get a treat. So they lined all up. All the kids lined up, waiting for this treat. And the treat was bread. It was stale. And they threw it across the gym floor, like this, and told the kids to go chase it. And that was their treat. And my dad, to this day, eats porridge and bread for breakfast. And regardless of how painful that memory is, he still does it. And we have to remember how ingrained this pain is in people's bodies and in their minds. I think about how children were starved, intentionally starved, and also children who didn't eat the food because it made them sick, literally sick, and they just refused to eat. So we had a lot of children who lost a lot of weight, a lot of children who gained a lot of weight because of the starches that were fed to the children. It was not natural foods, that's for sure. One of the other conclusions I've come up with, and I don't know if anyone would agree with me or not, but the more hungry you are, the easier it is to oppress you. If I keep you hungry, I can keep you oppressed. And if I feed you horrible food that doesn't sustain energy, the less likely you are to resist. The more likely you are to do everything I say. And so I think that the choice of food fed to the children, or the lack of food, was very intentional, and it was very deliberate. That food was not fed to them, or it was fed in the way it was to keep the children oppressed, and to make it less likely that they would resist. When the children returned home, a lot had changed. My auntie tells stories about how even when the children did go home during the summertime, that their families, their parents were sent out to work. So they didn't even get to see their parents at summertime because the Indian agent would send the parents out to go sugar beet hoeing down south. So the children would go home during the summertime and would be actually with other family members and not with their moms or dads. There was not a lot of hunting and gathering once children got home from residential school. So again, when I talk about attachment in relation to hunting, and I talk about attachment in relation to gathering and medicine picking and all of those wonderful things, that definitely is something that I see as a resurgence in our communities, and we're seeing that a lot more. I want to take a step back, or maybe not a step back, a step sideways, and just talk a little bit about how attachment is reciprocal. When we have a child, we are teaching that child healthy attachment but we are also learning healthy attachment as adults. I didn't learn healthy attachment. So when I had my babies, they taught me about attachment. That was my children's role, was to teach me about attachment. And thank God for them. Like, they talk about things that saved my life. Man, my kids did. And they taught me so much. I also think about my grandmother a lot. And my grandmother used to do this thing, and maybe some of you can relate to this, a lot of people can in a room usually, is when I used to walk into my grandmother's house, my kokum's house, she would be sitting on a rocking chair all the time. And she had her little ghetto blaster there, and she was playing round dance music most of the time. And I'd walk in and she'd say, Astam Newsom, come here, my grandchild. And we would sit on her lap. And the minute we'd sit on her lap, she'd start rocking us immediately. And she'd pat our backs. And she'd whistle. To a beat. Always to a beat. My grandmother was pretty darn smart. She was creating natural life rhythm. And if any of you have looked into neuroscience and understand brain development, life rhythm is so important. A child having a natural life rhythm is absolutely vital. When children are in utero and a woman is pregnant, and their heartbeat is usually the rhythm that child finds their life rhythm. And if a mother is in a lot of chaos and is experiencing trauma, that heartbeat's going to be all over the place. That little person, that little spirit in there is developing that same life pattern. And so when we have the children come into this spirit, or the physical realm, really important to create that life rhythm. My grandmother was doing that with us. And again, saved my life for the 20th time. She was amazing, and she knew exactly what she was doing. And we see trauma-informed research happening about those natural rhythms. My grandmother knew that gayas long time ago. Our ancestors knew that a long time ago. We have Indian swings, we have baby swings, we have all kinds of things that keep that natural life rhythm in our babies. So important and so vital. When we remove children, speaking of my grandmother, when we remove children from a home, we are removing the roles of parents. And those parents, I can't imagine what my grandmother must have been going through to have 10 children and 7 just gone, just like that. And I wonder how she survived that. We have home fires, and the way that I've seen it, or I've heard it put, is that the women are the keepers of that home fire, the metaphorical and the literal home fire. And the men's role is to collect the wood and put it by the door for her. That's the role of our men and women. And so we have home fires that were just extinguished, just put out when children were forcibly removed from homes. And we still have this happening. What time are we at? Can somebody, because I'm a jabberjaws, and
it's 2:38.
So how long do I have? Another 3 hours, yeah, around there. Till 6 o'clock tonight.
Until 3:30.
You guys are staying with me till 5, 6. We're good? Okay.
We have to be back in the room, I think, at 3:30.
Okay, cool. Okay. And I also want to leave some room for dialogue and all kinds of cool stuff too, if you guys have comments and things to say. Okay, cool. Okay. Then that means I need to get the show on the road. Okay. Nehiawa. That's what we are, Nehiawa. And that means the four-bodied people. The English word for that is Cree, but we're not Cree, we're Nehiawa. I don't identify myself as an Aboriginal person. I prefer not to use that word. I only use that word when I have to say it in the context of a program or something like that. To use the word Aboriginal, I actually find quite offensive. And the reason being is that when you put the prefix of like ab in front of a lot of different things, abnormal, abstract, ab this, ab that, it's something that's not original. It's something that's not, you can't really figure it out. You don't really know what it is. It's abstract, it's kind of confusing. No, we're pretty solid. It's pretty concrete what we are. And we're original. We're the original peoples of this territory. And so I don't use the word Aboriginal a lot. I don't really use the word Cree a lot, again, if I'm speaking to different groups, but I always identify as Neheo School. So that's what I am. I'm a four-bodied woman. And so the four-bodied is the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. And again, what I used to say a lot, that spirits were lost. And I found that to be really untruthful that I was saying that, because spirits weren't lost, they were stolen. And so I had to get real with myself, and I had to get real with what I was sharing, because I found that I was being really, how can I say this? I found that I was being really super gentle, overly gentle. And I think that we've done that enough. I think that we've been really, really gentle to the point where we've denied people truth. And I think that we need to stop doing that. I think it's okay for us to have uncomfortable conversation and that we can process it together. By no means do I want to be rude and ignorant and hurt anybody's feelings. That's not my intention either. But it definitely, I realized that I wasn't being honest and truthful with myself when I was using terminology that didn't feel right. But I would say it to protect somebody else. And I had to stop doing that. So I talk about the stealing of spirits. And again, a lot of stories about spirits that have been stolen at residential school. The name of this is Calling Our Spirit Back. And I was at a conference, a residential school symposium actually, and this elder was speaking. And he told a story, and he said that his spirit was taken from him at a very young age in residential school. And he was actually advised by elders. He said it took a long time for him to get his spirit back into his body. And he said it was left at that school. So he worked really hard to get it back. And he was advised by elders, you always call your spirit back when you travel. Always call it back. Literally, call it back. And he said, because your spirit was taken from you at one point, it can be taken from you again. And you have to be careful. Your spirit's fragile. So he did that. He always called his spirit back. And so that the title of this presentation is really owed to that man and his story about calling his spirit back, because I think that's what, as a collective, we all have to do. Indigenous, from wherever you're Indigenous from, because we're all Indigenous peoples. We all have people from somewhere, from people. We all belong from someplace. And my mom's Scottish. She comes, her ancestors come from Scotland, but she was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario. And my mom often calls herself a white woman. And I get mad at her and I say, you're not a white woman. You have people. You're a Scottish woman. And I also find the word white very offensive. I don't like to use it. I prefer to use moriang, which is our word for a Caucasian person. But you have people. We were all tribal. Doesn't matter where you come from. We are all tribal people. We all have a people. We all have music and we all have drums. Guarantee you can find that in your culture. So I think about sometimes if our spirits were taken from us and we are the four-bodied people, how do we function every day without one part of us just gone? If our spirit is taken from us, how do we go around every day and function the way that a lot of times society really expects us to function? The other important thing that I'll just quickly go over with this part is about emotional literacy. I used to do. Okay, yeah, no, but I do want to leave some space though, so I'm conscious of that. But I used to work with people who were wanting to overcome addictions, lots of different kinds of addictions in my home community. And I remember I used to sit in a circle with them, and I used to say, so tell me how you feel today. And they would look at me like, I'm all right. I'm okay. I'm kind of pissed off today. You know, like it was, and I would always be like, no, let's get to the root. And you know, so naive and so ridiculous of me. But and what I really understood after a while is going back to that. What didn't you get? I didn't get someone saying to me, "How was your day today? How are you feeling today?" Never asked that. I had parents who were so in crisis mode constantly and so emotionally unavailable that I didn't have the opportunity to say, I'm feeling really rejected today, or I'm feeling really sad, or I don't know what I just did to that, but that's the next slide. But I didn't have that. And so I was sitting in a room full of people who never had that either. So when you ask someone how they're feeling, they don't know. They have no idea. They don't have this library or this bank of emotions. And so we really had to go just back to square one and really start understanding emotions and start giving people that emotional literacy. Because I think, again, the expectation is that we should know what we're feeling. And actually, another teaching from my auntie is she said the teachings of our people is that it is not the responsibility of a child to tell you how you're feeling, how they're feeling, sorry. It is the responsibility of the adult to be so in tune with that child that they should know what that child is feeling. So it's not up to a child to come up to you and say, you know what, today I'm feeling really rejected. It is my role as a mom to be so in tune with my kids that I know when something's going on. When my 10-year-old gets in the vehicle after school and she has a sore tummy, I'm like, oh, okay. Did you eat something bad today? No. What happened? And it's always, always a friendship issue, or, you know, her friend got mad at her at the school, you know, like it's something like that. It's my role to be in tune with my kids. It's not their job. Unfortunately, what had happened in residential schools is that there was absolutely none of that. There was absolutely nobody helping you, nobody as a sounding board, no one asking you how you're feeling. So you had a generation of children who became adults who still don't have that emotional literacy and who didn't teach it to their children. The other purpose of mentioning that piece about sore tummy is I was also taught that as women, our spirit lives in our stomachs. And our spirits can also live in the nape of our necks. So I know when I'm super stressed out and when I'm feeling something, my tummy gets really super knotty and anxious and I get sore in my neck. And that's where our spirits live. And so it's no wonder that that's where we get the feeling. As men, I don't know where your spirit lives and I don't want to know. Okay? You guys got to figure it out on your own. Let's ask the men in the room. Hello, men. Where does your spirit live? Or there, yes. And I guarantee you, there's teachings around that. I'm not a man. I can't speak for men, so I definitely can't say. But yeah, no, there's teachings around that as well. As a second generation, as the daughter of a residential school survivor, I spent a lot of my life super angry and really sad, and I had no idea why. Not a freaking clue why I was so pissed off all the time, or why I was super sad. And when I started to learn about residential schools, I started learning about, oh wait, this is why I'm pissed off. Oh, hey, I have a reason, and I have a right. I have a right to be angry. I have a right to be sad, because this is what happened. And I didn't know that happened. I didn't know it happened the way it did. When I heard the word residential schools, it was always like, okay, it was the school that our parents were sent to. I had no idea what happened until I was in my 20s. And I'll tell you, it was amazing to actually not have to blame myself for the way I was self-harming. I could actually say, you know what? There's a reason why I feel so pissed off. And so a lot of people that I've worked with in my generation, the people that are around the same age as me and people whose parents and grandparents have gone to residential school, and they say things like, I'm just so pissed off all the time, or I'm really sad all the time. And I'm like, do you know about residential school? Do you know about your parents' history? Like, that's something let's talk about that. And it gives you some clarity around why you're so angry. And a lot of our people are walking around today with a lot of anger and pain, and they don't know why. They have no understanding of why they feel the way they do. Also important to understand, and I'm sure you guys probably, I think there was actually a session about this, which I would have wanted to go to. I'm going to skip out actually now and leave and go to the other one. No, I'm kidding. But about where we hold trauma in our bodies. And I actually just had a conversation with one of my friends. He's from Musqueam, and him and I went to a movie, and we were talking, and he was saying, my knee is killing me. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, I don't know. I said, well, did you hurt it? Like, did you fall on it? And he said, no. I got out of my truck and my knee's killing me. And then he started talking about his week. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, Amber, don't get too social worky. Come on, just listen. And of course, my social worker was like, ding, and I can't separate the two anyway. But I said to him, I said, do you think it might be stress related? Why your knee's hurting? And he said, I don't know. Do you think so? I said, it might be. I said, do you think maybe you've had some past trauma in your knee? And that's kind of where you're holding it? He's like, hey, you know what? I think you might be right. So we had this really cool conversation about it. But a lot of times we find that we have a lot of pain in our bodies and we don't know why. And a lot of that is because that's where we hold our trauma and we hold it there and we hold pain there. I'll go on to this one. Okay, so I want to see where I'm at. Okay, good. So I mentioned earlier that we are living out the colonization and trauma that we've experienced. And I say we, meaning everybody. We are all living out that colonization. It doesn't matter where you come from. We are all living it out together. And our relationships need a lot of work. And I think we're on the right track. I think we're definitely on the right track. I see a lot of really cool things happening. But just some kind of, we talk sometimes, and again I mentioned this earlier, that we talk sometimes about residential school as being something that's really far away. It was back then, it was not, it was a long time ago. And we still do hear people say things like, get over it. And, you know, you got your money, let it go. My dad was playing field hockey when he was a kid. And he was playing field hockey while he was at Blue Quills. And he cut his hand open, and he went to the nurse. And he asked for a Band-Aid. And the nurse beat him with a stick. And he has a bent ear. One of his ears is bent because of that beating. And after she beat him, she gave him an orange. And sent him on his way. That is the story of our people. We have this open wound, and when you go to ask for a Band-Aid for your boo-boo, you're told that your pain is not valid. Get over it. You got your money, get over it. That orange is that compensation out of guilt. It's not helpful. Guilt is never helpful. If you stay stuck in guilt and shame, we will never move forward. Our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, I've had a lot of my colleagues say to me that they've experienced white guilt. And I tell them all the time, that's not helpful. It's not helpful for you to stay in guilt. And it's not helpful for us to stay in the shame. We're not going to move forward if we stay stuck in those places. 70% of the kids in Karen, Alberta are brown flesh children. That number is alarming, and again, I think that there's a lot of things that are in the works. A lot of things are happening to try and change that number and to bring down that number. Our rates of chronic illness, diabetes, for example, my dad's a diabetic. The rates of diabetes are just disgusting. But again, if I go back to that conversation about the food that was fed in residential schools, I can make immediate connections to why we have so much diabetes in our communities. Immediate connections to that. Our rates of homelessness, I think 50% of the population, the homeless population in Edmonton, is brown-skinned people. Because I'm a Native woman, because I'm a Nehiyah woman, I am 5 times more likely to die of a violent death, simply because I am Nehiyah. Our youth suicide rates are, again, at epidemic proportions. I was just talking to a friend of mine not long ago, and we have 10-year-olds hanging themselves. It's the same age as my baby. And it overwhelms me with, I sometimes sit there and wonder, man, you don't want to be in my brains, and actually your brains are probably the same way. But, you know, sometimes I sit there at night and I think, what happened in your life at 10? How much pain you must have been in to do that, to feel like there was nothing else. And that just makes me just so sad. And I think about that often and how we have to do something. We have to do something. All of us together, we have to do something. And again, I think that's why we're all here. we have about 50% of Canadians who don't know what residential schools are. It's a huge amount of people, 50%. What we also know is that Canada has done a really good job of ripping us all off of some really vital information. I remember at the university and sitting in classrooms and students learning about residential school for the first time, and they'd say, how come no one told us this? How did we not know this? And they felt really betrayed by the school system, super betrayed, because they had no idea. And again, people don't know what they don't know. But again, I think that there has been a real denial of the truth. Because why would you, who wants to really fully understand that and let that sit with them? It's scary. It's a scary thing to learn that stuff. And I also think that there's been a denial of the truth, again, to protect people from that truth. And that's a natural human kind of defense mechanism, is to protect ourselves. And one of the ways we've done that is by miseducating people or not giving them anything at all. I've often said, and I will continue to say over and over and over again, if you plan on being a social worker or any type of helper in the province of Alberta, you have to know a little something about Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being. It's just because the chances of you working with someone who looks exactly like me, this brown-skinned woman, pretty high. You're going to be working with someone who looks just like me and who has the same whack of issues. And so you got to know something. We got to know something. And I'm talking about us too. Indigenous people have to know too. Along with that, knowing about our history, the history of trauma is important, but also knowing about what the smell of sweetgrass is, how that smells. My niece is in a program, and she came home from her program one day, and she was talking to one of the girls who was in the program with her, and that young lady said to her, she said, yeah, her children, this young lady's children are in care. And she said, my social worker came to visit me the other day. And she said, I had just finished smudging my house with sage. She said, my social worker walked in and she said, what is that smell? And so the young lady said, I just smudged. And that social worker said, bullshit, show me. So the young lady pulled out her sage and showed it to the lady. I still don't believe you. Light it. Let me smell it. So the young lady lit that sage and let that woman smell it. And that young lady said, never again will I smudge before my social worker comes over. And I thought, how unsafe is that? How unsafe it was for her to have to light her sage to prove to that social worker that it wasn't marijuana. It doesn't smell like marijuana. I've smoked a joint or two in my life. It doesn't smell the same. Trust me, it doesn't. So all people should know what sage smells like. All people should know what a rattle is. The purpose of this. This is sisiguan. And that sisiguan it's an icon, it's a spiritual icon of our people, but this is actually the voice. So this speaks for us when we can't speak. And that's what that is. We have drums, we have, depending on the tribe, different tribes have different, some of our tribes down south don't use drums. That's more of a northern First Nations instrument. But we have all of these things, and that's people need to know that cool stuff about us, because we're really cool people. I'm serious, we are. And we're beautiful people. Man, like I swear to you, if there's one gift that we have that is so obvious everywhere we go is our humor. Man, I tell you, like we'll be in pure sadness and devastation, and someone will crack a joke and it's just like, yeah, there it is. That's the good stuff there. And I was at a conference not long ago in Washington, D.C., and I was presenting alongside a lady who was talking about trauma. And she talked about how humor is how humor can be used as a way to avoid dealing with trauma. And I had to present after her. I'm like, okay, this is going to be a little awkward. And I said in response to that I didn't believe that was true from my understanding, from my people's understanding, is that if there, my dad, I'll tell you a short story. when we were kids, my dad and my mom, they had just bought a new truck. And we live right next to a little town called St. Paul. And we pulled up to St. Paul PV Mart in our new truck. And there was my brown-fleshed dad and my white-fleshed mother. And then me and my brother in the back seats. And my brother was a hockey player. He still is, but he played a lot of hockey. And so he had his hockey equipment in the back of the cab of the truck. And these two muniao. Does everyone know what muniao means now? Yes. Okay. These two people were walking out of PV Mart holding a 2x4. They're holding it together and they're bumping into stuff, staring at us, just staring. Probably wondering, what the heck? Who is this guy driving this truck? And I don't know, all the assumptions that they probably made in their head. And of course my dad, he gets out of the truck and he said, JJ, that's my brother's name. JJ, you get that hockey equipment and you move it into the front of the truck. You know how these white people are. They like to steal. My mom was so embarrassed. And she's like, George, stop that right now. And me and my brother were like, I think we were red in the face, but that's my dad. And he, and to be quite honest, that may be a defense mechanism. It might be. He has to protect himself. He has to. But at the same time, his humor just makes everything so much lighter and more beautiful. And he's constantly teasing everybody, and he's known for that. I mean, a lot of our parents are known for that humor, and it's beautiful. My uncle, when he was dying of colon cancer, and I remember him saying to us, laughter and tears, two of the best medicines you'll ever have in your life, two of the best therapies you'll ever have. And it's true. I use them quite often, actually. Going back to that piece about cultural safety, about the young lady who lit the smudge in her home, one of the things that I think, one of the reasons for the lack of cultural safety has been that there has been a real lack of education and a lack of awareness, and that has made it very unsafe for Indigenous people to be who they are. And so we have to create spaces. We have to create our own space for this understanding to take place. And it has to be done on our terms, with us, not for us. Because again, we don't need saving. We need your help though. We need allies, absolutely need allies. And that ally relationship is reciprocal. I am your ally too, whoever you are. And if you're my ally, man, we got to work together, and I'll be your ally too. If we look at some of the ways that we treat people through treatment and different things like that, we use very quick kind of problem solving and different types of techniques that are pretty fast. And I think a lot of that is done because we need to save a lot of money, and that we want to kind of get people in and out, in and out, in and out, get them healed real quick. 28-day treatment facilities. 28 days, you got 28 days, man. You better heal up real quick. And I'm not putting those things down. I mean, I used to send people to them. I used to refer people to those treatment programs. It was a good starting place for a lot of people. But I look at someone like my dad, who's had like 60 years of pain. Can't fix that in 28 days. There's absolutely no way. My dad always says, my girl, the day you bury me is the day I'll be healed. That's the day I'll be fully healed, and I'll be me again. And so we've just had to love him for who he is. And that's what we do. And, the man is a beautiful man. He makes mistakes. Lots of them. And yet, I see him with his grandchildren, and man, there's nothing like that. I maybe didn't get the I love yous and the hugs, but my kids get it tenfold. Tenfold. And my mom always says, this is our second chance. These kids right here are our second chance. And we're going to do it right. And do they ever? My dad texts me and calls me. He learned how to text. He's 71. You can only imagine what those text messages look like. I can put some up on the screen if you like. But he texts me sometimes, every morning at like 6 o'clock in the morning. How you doing, my 3 babies? Love you. Have a good day. He calls us all the time. How you doing? How are my 3 babies? And when my kids see him, they just, Musam, that means grandfather, and they just go running to him, and he just wraps them up in his arms, and he sings to them, and he plays with them, and he takes them places, and what you may see a lot with our parents who attended residential school is that they buy a lot. They buy a lot of stuff for their grandchildren or their children. A lot of that has to do with guilt. A lot of that has to do with making up for through physical things. And I always tell my dad, don't buy my kids anything. He'll say, well, we're going to stop at the store. No, don't buy my kids anything. Just come. Just be here. Take them somewhere. Speak Cree to them. Read them, some kind of book. And again, I have an issue with the word literacy, especially English literacy, because my dad is what we would consider illiterate, but he's not. He's very literate, very, very literate in his Cree language, in his Nehiyaw tongue. He works as a security guard up north in the camps in the oil field industry, and he calls us sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning when he's working a night shift and asks us how to spell words, basic words. That's what I mean when I say that place wasn't a school. My dad left there with maybe a grade 3 education, maybe, and if you were lucky, you got a grade 6. If you were lucky. Those schools were intended to kill the Indian and the child, and to turn the men into farmhands and send the women off to be maids. That's what those schools were intended for. They were not intended to educate children the way that we would see education today. And so my dad's a perfect example of how that education failed. Very, very, very badly. I don't speak my language fluently. That's one of the things. My sister Shayna, she constantly reminds me. She'll say things like, "Residential school took away the language I should have had. Residential school took away the identity that I should have had from a very young age, and residential school took away the father I was rightfully should have had, the way the Creator intended him to be." Because the way he was not the way the Creator intended him to be. And so, because of how he was treated for speaking his language, he didn't teach us. And he did that to protect us, I know that. He didn't want us speaking fluent Cree because he didn't want us to get beaten for it. And so we didn't learn it. I'm learning now, and it's fun. Really difficult, but fun. And when I think about what I'm missing out on when I don't know my language, my auntie says our language is our moral compass. Our language teaches us everything about how to be in relationship with one another. So my mum is Nigawi. That's how I say mum in Cree. My auntie is Nigawis. She's my little mother. So she's not just my auntie. She's not just my mom's sister. She's my little mother. And so if anything was to ever happen to my mother, my auntie would take over the role as mom immediately. And she already does. So another example of that is when my sister moved to the United States. She got married out there, and she took her 2 older girls with her. Went through a really rotten divorce, a very painful divorce, and called me one day saying, "I don't know if I can do this." Her girls were, of course, behaving differently because of the divorce. And so she said to me, "I don't know if I could do this." And I said, "Send them home. I'll take them." And they were 14 and 17 at the time. And she sent them home to me. And I took care of them for her. That's my role. That's my role as their auntie, as their little mother. When my sister was at her wit's end and ready to commit suicide, I took her children and I said, "Nope, I'll take them for you. You get well. They'll be okay." And they are. They're all, they see each other all the time, and they stayed here. They didn't want to move back to the United States, but they see their mother all the time. And that was my role, was to do that not for my sister, but for our family. That was my role. We hear a lot about traditional adoptions. That still happens in our communities. We don't necessarily need a system to do that for us. We can do that ourselves, and I've seen them done in a lot of different ceremonies, so those things still happen as well as traditional adoptions. I'm fully aware that the blood that ran through my grandmother Sarah Dion's veins is running through mine right now. I'm so aware of that. I'm aware of the ancestral the blood knowledge, the DNA that I have inside of me. I am aware of where it comes from. I am conscious of it. I know that it's in me. It's like a surge of energy that I can't deny. I know that when certain things happen, I'm like, I don't know where I've seen that before. I don't know but I know that. I know that from somewhere. And that's my ancestral knowledge. That's in my DNA. And I've thankfully been very in tune with that, especially in the last 6-7 years of my life. There's ethical guidelines. There's ethical teachings that are innate. They're in us, and we all have them. And especially when it comes to some of the teachings from our grandparents. I just want to take a second to just kind of really look at how some of our Indigenous ways of healing have really been put on, I don't know, well, how can I say it? Well, they've kind of just been like, oh, that doesn't matter. We're not doing it that way. That's not okay. We have for a very long time put Western ways of healing on a pedestal, and that's just the way. I used to work a lot with moms and dads who have had their children removed from their care, and they used to have to go to treatment in order to get their children back in their care. And I would fight with child welfare sometimes and say, why does it have to be a treatment center? Why does it have to be that? Why can't it be they go see an elder? Why can't it be that they go to sweat lodges and they have that regular visits with those elders and they go home and they practice and they go home and they practice? And why does it have to be that? Well, that's the mandate. Well, I don't like your mandate. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't know if I like that too much. And I think that there has been a real, well, our ceremonies were outlawed. Let's be real. Our ceremonies were outlawed a long time ago. And they had to hide them underground, and they had to hide them so that they would still be here for people like me. And thankfully they did that. Thankfully they held on. We are now at a place where we can practice. Again, there's still some unsafety, but we can practice. And I think that the rest of the world needs to kind of catch up. And we need to work together on that. We need to create space for that, for traditional healing and for ancestral knowledge. And that it needs to be on the same buffet table as any other treatment model. Doesn't matter what kind of treatment model you use. Hey, you know what? My dad went to like 32 treatment centers. No lie, 32. My sister, who's struggling with addictions, is in detox right now. She's leaving to treatment on Friday. Treatment, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but there has to be something else. There has to be something else. Culture is the best medicine, I believe. It's the best medicine. And if we deny people that, I do training for foster parents, for caregivers, about Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And I'm a little bit disturbed sometimes because some of the cultural planning is a little off, to say the least. But Pocahontas is not fulfilling a cultural plan. Pocahontas is a story of colonization, actually. Pocahontas does not look like us. This is not Pocahontas. I don't know where that came from. But Pocahontas is not part of a cultural plan. Taking a child, a brown-skinned child, to a round dance once a year is not a cultural plan. It's a great start. Heck yeah, take them to round dances. But I often tell people, when you open your doors to Indigenous children, you don't have a choice of whether or not you want them involved in their culture. That's not an option. If I open my doors to a person from another background, another history, another ethnic, whatever people want to call it, I don't have the right to refuse them of their culture. That's not okay. And so we have to have things like, hey, you know what? Play powwow music on your iPad when they walk in the door. Have sage burning when they walk in the door. If I think about what reminds me of home, it smells. When I walk into somewhere and I smell sage, I'll tell you, I'm like, oh, I'm home. I don't know where it might be, but I'm home. When I see pictures of people who look like me on the walls, I feel home. There's a lot of different things that we can do besides Pocahontas and Brother Bear, or whatever that movie's called. It's a cute movie, but it's not a cultural plan. We have to raise the consciousness by ensuring that Indigenous ways of doing and knowing are put at that same level as any other model, anything else. Does that make sense? hope I'm not like really pissing people off here. When people get angry, they do something though, eh? So it kind of sparks it. Last slide. What time are we at?
We are at 3:50.
Oh, okay. I'll go over this very quickly. Isn't it crazy how you save like the most important stuff for last and then you only have like 5 minutes to talk about it? I'll just very quickly, this is something that we're actually working on right now. In the 2 years, the contract with University of Calgary, the University of Calgary did a really good job of conning me into working there. They did that because they told me my job would be 50-50, but it was actually 100-100. And so part of my role was instruction, and the other part of the role was to do some research with outcomes-based service delivery with COCIO. If anyone is familiar with that, it's an outcomes-based service delivery program delivered through Ventura Traditional Healing Society with the partners of Boyle Street and, of course, the Ministry of Human Services. So we are working on, and we have been in the works for 2 years, working on a model of practice. And even that feels icky to call it a model of practice because it's not. It's an ancient, it's our ancestors' knowledge. And we're calling it practice as ceremony. And basically what it is a new way, a new old way of practicing where we bring back humanity. Simple. There's a lot of different ways of practicing that are considered the new thing and so on. What I notice is that policies and procedures and mandates and law and legislation, man, those things get changed every day. Those are easy to change. It's human hearts that we have to change. That's the real work, is changing human hearts. And that's the work that we're in for. And that's the work that I'm in for. Change the policies. Cool. Policies are words on paper. We put power to that. And I used to blame policy all the time. Oh my gosh, I was like, it's the policy, it's the system. No, it's not. It's people. It's human beings. And we need to change. Our hearts need to change. We need to be invested in this together as part of the healing journey. Reconciliation means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And for me, this is reconciliation. This is a step in reconciliation. And I know the city is committed to that, is committed to reconciliation. And I think that by you all being here, you all demonstrate commitment to reconciliation, which I think is absolutely amazing. But the only thing that I will say about practice as ceremony is that it follows the Sundance, our Neheo Sundance, and it's the actual model itself. If any of you would like to hear more about it or have some more information, I can definitely email it to you so that you have, because there's an actual diagram and everything that goes along with it. This is a 3-day presentation all on its own. I just wanted to talk about it, not go into details so much, just because, like I said, it's a very long thing. It's a 2-year project. But if any of you would like some more information, absolutely, I'd be willing to share it with you, no problem. COCIO is in the beginning stages of using practice as ceremony as their one of their values systems, I guess you can say. The last thing I want to say very quickly is that I'm very thankful that that I'm here, and I'm very aware that I am so accountable. I am so accountable to my ancestors. And I am so accountable to my grandmother. I am so accountable to my father. And I'm accountable to my children and all the generations to come. And I know that it is through their resistance and it is through their survival that that's why I'm here. My dad survived something that he should not have survived. He wasn't supposed to survive that, but he did. He physically walked out of those doors so that I could be here. And I'm so aware of that, and I'm so thankful for him. And I owe this work to them. And so when I speak my truth, because there's lots of different truths, when I speak mine, I am speaking because I am accountable to them. And I have to be respectful of them. And by telling any other thing, by saying anything else, I wouldn't be honoring their resistance, and I wouldn't be honoring their existence, because they existed. They resisted so that I could be here and that we could be here together. And I think that that's a really amazing thing. And so if we look at the people that we work with that sit across the table from us, look at them as an act of resistance, that they've survived things that probably they shouldn't have survived. And if we look at them as a way of as an act of resistance, it changes the relationship we have with them. Instead of looking at them from a deficit place, looking at them from that place. So that's it. Hi. I know if there's questions. You have 2 seconds for questions. Ready, set, go.